Today's topic is Naked and Unafraid, and the speaker is Mark POMERY, the soon-to-be birthday boy.
Hey, welcome to our Elevate online family from wherever it is in the world you're joining us. Great to have you here. Now, as Mombi has already revealed, I am the soon-to-be birthday boy, which is next week. So when you join us for our online experience next week, it'll be my birthday. So I encourage you to bring your own cake to wherever it is you're joining us from. And while I'm preaching, you can eat cake, which you can't always do if you're in a physical church building. So there's an advantage of the technology that we're using for our online experience. I must point out though, Mombi did bury the lead because today is actually her birthday. So here's what I want you to do is I want you to give Mombi a shout out in the comments section, wish her a happy birthday. If you aren't sure how to spell Mombi, our media team spent hours designing this. So this is how you, let's see. All right, Siri, quiet please. There you go. It's back to front. I think our media team, well, I'll have a coaching conversation with him. We'll sort it out. This is week 2 of our brand new series called Naked and Unafraid. And the series is all about embracing the risks and experiencing the rewards of living a large and expansive life. And last week, our great friend Steve Hall launched this series with a message we called risk exposure. The big idea there is that playing it safe is dangerous. And he looked at a story from the life of King David and David's wife, Michal. And Michal decided to experience life looking out the window compared with David, who was experiencing the joy of life and the rewards of life dancing on the street. And dancing on the street is always better than simply holding back and looking out the window. Well, today in week 2, I want to talk about abandoning smallness. And this idea of abandoning smallness comes from something that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth. So if you've got a second device, phone, tablet, if you've got a second device, I encourage you to open the Bible app, join with us, open the Bible app to 2 Corinthians. So this is the second letter that Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, 2 Corinthians chapter 6, and I'm going to read from the Message version. And I want to just drill right into that from the get-go and then unpack that idea that Paul highlights as we continue through this message. And he wrote this with a great deal of affection. You can see this in the words he's writing. Dear Corinthians, I can't tell you how much I long for you to enter this wide, open, spacious life. We didn't fence you in. And, you know, the we there is the church leaders. And in fact, you know, as representatives of God, it's even highlighting that God didn't fence you in. The smallness you feel comes from within you. Your lives aren't small, but you're living them in a small way. Look, I'm speaking as plainly as I can and with great affection. Open up your lives. Live openly and expansively. You know, Paul highlighted the problem that the church in Corinth were living their lives fenced in, living their lives in a small way. And then inviting them and challenging them to make a shift, to actually move from inside this fence of smallness, to actually break free of that fence, move beyond that fence of smallness and start to experience the wide, open, spacious life that God calls us to and that God promises as followers of Jesus. Now, my wife, Louisa, about 5 years ago, she was working in an admin job at a high school. And she really felt, she appreciated that she was making a contribution in that role to the lives of teenagers at that school, but she really felt that God was calling her to make an even greater impact and to actually move towards gaining a qualification as a teacher, as a high school teacher. And so whilst working this full-time job, she took on an overload course of study at university, and she worked solidly for studying in addition to working full-time for several years to gain, ultimately she went from gaining her bachelor's degree in education, and then straight after that she leapt into gaining her master's degree in education. And today she's she spent some time teaching in the classroom, as is pretty standard, and then was promoted to a middle leadership role at her high school, where she's now the head of year over 600 students in that high school. And for her, it was about responding to this call that she felt God had put in her life, and responding to the potential that she recognized that was in her. And yet it still required her to make the move, to move beyond the fence. She could have stayed in the fence, and it was a good job. The admin job was a good job. And by the way, I'm not saying that if you're in an admin job that you're living life in a small way. No. In fact, as someone who's not an admin person, I am grateful for every single one of you who is called and gifted in the area of admin. That's not the point. The point is that some of us in any area of life, and it could be career, it could be anything, that we are called to live in God's wide open spaces. However, we can find ourselves settling to the confinement of the fence of smallness. See, there's actually two versions of you. There's mini me, you might recognize him, but there's the mini you, and then there's the real you. The real you is the you that God has called you and is calling you to become. And the real you emerges and grows from the inside out. But it doesn't happen automatically. It happens because daily, weekly, monthly, yearly, you and I decide that we're going to continue to take next steps to move away from the fence of smallness and live and move and experience God's wide open spaces. Before we can identify some solutions, it's always critical to have a clear handle on the problem. And so I want to run some diagnostics. I want to run some diagnostics very, very quickly that maybe identify or highlight if you and I may be living small in one or more areas of our life. So I'm going to walk these through, and I want you to just be honest. You're there, we're not there, we're not judging you, we're not going to be, but just be honest with yourself whether the warning light on your dashboard comes on when I talk about any of these things. And I'm going to walk through them pretty quickly. Just so you know, the slide decks for all of our messages are actually on our website, elevatechurch.me. So whilst I'm going through these reasonably quickly today, you can revisit them at elevatechurch.me, look through the slide decks. So let me go through some potential diagnostics that might highlight that you're living small, living fenced in. Maybe you're petty, that the people you gravitate towards and the conversations you gravitate towards are all small and kind of trivial, unimportant kind of conversations. Maybe you're holding a grudge. When you hold a grudge, when you're holding on to a grudge, you're actually anchored to that point or that person or that incident, and it prevents you from moving forward. That becomes your fence that you're living within. Maybe you're too self-conscious. It's good to be self-aware, But there's a difference between self-awareness and being self-conscious. And often people that are too self-conscious are worried about what people are thinking about them, only to later discover that the people that they were worried about what they were thinking about them weren't even thinking about them. Maybe you live inward. You're withdrawn emotionally because you don't want to risk being vulnerable. You don't want people to see the real you because of what you're afraid they might discover. Maybe you shrink back. In your workplace, when there's an opportunity to take a next step or to get involved in a project or take on a little bit more responsibility, maybe you shrink back because your default is you're worried about failure or other people criticizing you. Maybe you spend too much time comparing yourself to others. And instead of being inspired by others, which is actually where there's a healthy comparison, you find yourself intimidated by others and saying you could never shape up, you could never reach that standard or that level. And that becomes the fence that you live behind. Maybe you pass up opportunities to contribute, into a conversation, in your marriage, in your family, because again, you're afraid of not measuring up. Maybe you're uncomfortable giving a compliment. See, if you're living fenced in and thinking small about who you are and what you have to offer, then it's very difficult to be generous and to be encouraging towards others, because instead of looking at the opportunity to be generous and encouraging other people, you're simply rating yourself below them and feeling like you're not worthy of complimenting them. Or if you do compliment them, you see it as a reminder of just how small you are. Well, here's the last one. And I haven't meant this to be judgy, and it might have hurt a little, but I'm just running the diagnostics because this may be something that's fencing you in. Or you might have ticked even more than one of these. And God wants you to move beyond that. So we've got to first identify the problem. So the last one is maybe you have a negative outlook, that your default is about what could go wrong or what is wrong versus what could go right or how we could make things better. Check out this creature. Do you recognize it? If you think it's a deer, you would be wrong. It is actually the African impala. Now, the African impala, here's a couple of fun facts about the African impala. Number one, the African impala has the ability to jump 3 meters high and 10 meters forward. 3 meters high and 10 meters forward. Pretty significant. And you would think with the African impala's ability to jump 3 meters high and 10 meters forward, that it would be very difficult for a zookeeper to keep the African impala in any level of captivity in a zoo setting. And yet these animals who can jump 3 meters high and 10 meters forward are often found in enclosures with only a fence that's 1 meter high. Nothing above it, and nothing higher than 1 meter in front of it. And the African impalas stay within that fence, even though they have the potential to easily jump over that fence. And the reason is that the African impala doesn't like to jump when they can't see where they're going to land. Or let me phrase it differently. They don't like to move beyond the fence when there's no guarantee of the outcome. It was around 10 years ago, Louisa and I, my wife and I, were living in Melbourne, and I was interviewing for senior leader jobs at several churches around Melbourne, and we really felt that we could actually establish the next chapter of our life there. We love Melbourne. We have a lot of great friends there, and I was interviewing with some really great churches and looking at, just like really exciting opportunities. And I remember in this time when I was interviewing with these churches, I remember God speaking to me very, very clearly. I'm not one of those people that I even think I hear the voice of God like too often, like distinctly. But this was one of those times where I did, and I really felt God tell us to move back to Perth. And he unpacked that a little bit more, and I'll share that with you another time. But the reality of the situation is that I was in the midst of an interview process with several great churches in Melbourne, and felt God say to me, and therefore to us, to move back to Perth, even though I didn't have a single interview. I hadn't even contacted a church. I wouldn't, let alone put in an application, let alone started the interview process. And we did. We chose to move back to Perth, even though there was no guarantee of the outcome. Well, there was a guarantee. The guarantee was God's word. But sometimes, look, let's face it, real talk, sometimes we don't even think that's enough. We want to see the application, the interview, the job offer, or whatever it is. And I don't share that story as a flex. I just share it as an encouragement to you that I'm smoking what I'm selling, and that I'm playing by the exact same principles that I'm encouraging you with, and that we're encouraging you with in this series, that we can, if we choose to live naked and unafraid, embrace the risks, we'll also experience the rewards of this wide open expanse of life that God's promised. But it requires us to move beyond the fence. The mini-me likes to live inside the fence. The real you, the you that God's called you to with boundless potential, has to move beyond the fence of certainty in order to experience those rewards. Now, this same guy, Paul, that wrote the letter to the church in Corinth, also wrote a letter, or ultimately he wrote a couple of letters, but I want to drop you into a slice of a letter he wrote to one of his proteges. It was a guy named Timothy. And Timothy was the senior leader of the church in Ephesus at the time, likely in his mid-30s. Some people say he was 18. That's probably not true. But in that culture, being in your mid-30s was still considered very young. And it's quite likely that there was some older people in the community and older people in the church that might have been looking down at him because he was young. And Paul wrote in the second letter that he wrote to Timothy, he wrote this, and I'm going to read it in two different versions, very much overlapping, but just so we really get this clear. Paul wrote to Timothy, "For the Spirit God gave us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline." Or in another version, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of self-discipline." Paul wrote this to Timothy because Timothy was timid. Timothy was experiencing fear. Timothy was living inside the fear fence. And yet God had called him to lead this church and lead it into wide open spaces. And the only way he was going to be able to lead the church into wide open spaces is if he himself was moving into wide open spaces and calling other people with him. And Paul outlined that Timothy had a choice. Timothy faced a crossroad. Timothy had to decide whether he was going to go as the mini-me version of Timothy and give into the fence of fear and timidity, or whether he was going to allow God to grow him from the inside out and embrace the promises of God that are beyond that fence of fear, that the promises of love and of power and of self-discipline. But Timothy still had to make the choice himself to abandon smallness. Now, this thing of fear that Paul spoke to, it's not the sort of fear that you experience when your life's suddenly in danger. It's not the sort of fear that you experience when you're on an airplane, when we were allowed to go on airplanes. It's not the sort of fear you experience when you're on an airplane and the plane starts to shake of turbulence. That would be what I call acute fear. You know, you just, your heart rate's going, your emotions are going here, and then something happens. You're confronted with something that causes your fear to spike almost vertically. You know, that's acute fear. And that one really gets your attention. And that one typically evokes the fight or flight response. You know, you will almost certainly respond to acute fear. The sort of fear that Paul was warning Timothy of is chronic fear. Fear that's just living and brewing and flowing beneath the surface, but it's flowing every day. And it threads its way through every circumstance of life. And here's why it's so dangerous, is it doesn't evoke this same vertical spike that acute fear does. It's far more subtle. And the problem with it being far more subtle is it's far easier to ignore. And in fact, it's far easier to live with. But that's the problem. And that's the threat, that if we don't choose to abandon smallness, we will live inside the fear fence. Now, Steve last week talked about the importance of vulnerability in taking a risk. Well, the same principle needs to be applied in abandoning smallness, that we need to be vulnerable. Let me just take a moment to define what I mean when I say vulnerability, because I think the most common application or the most common understanding of this concept of vulnerability is about, you know, showing your emotions, risking telling people, you know, your feelings, risking people seeing, you know, some of the ugly parts of your world. And that is true. I mean, that is one way vulnerability plays out. The way I want to define vulnerability as far as it pertains to abandoning smallness is this: that vulnerability is making a move with no guarantee of the outcome. And like Louisa, it might be a course of study that you have the choice of whether or not to commit to, that may lead you into more of who God's called you to be. It may be a business opportunity. It may be putting your hand up for a project at work, even though there's no guarantee of the outcome. It might be investing in somebody, investing in them, speaking words of life into them, encouraging them, taking an influential leadership role in their life, even though you're not perfect. And they'll see that. It could be inviting somebody into a church setting where you know, they are more likely to be able to experience an encounter with God. You know, it might be inviting them to come and sit on your couch while you watch and join in our online experience. Or inviting them along to a church. You know, Christmas is coming and there'll be churches all around the world with their doors wide open. Well, mostly. You know, being vulnerable is making sure you don't treat your Christianity as classified information. So let me leave you with this question. What is God calling you to do that's going to require you to abandon smallness and move beyond that fence? See you next week for my birthday.